known territory or what's explored, unknown territory or what's not explored, the transformation or the dissolution of one into the other, and then the reconstitution of that. That's what an election does, right? It's like, okay, we have our leader who's the person at the top of the dominance hierarchy and defines the nature of this particular structure. There's an election. It's regulated chaos. No one knows what's going to happen. It's the death of the old king. Bang, we go into a chaotic state. Everyone argues for a while. And then out of that argument, they produce a consensus and poof, we're in a new state. Right? That's the meta story, right? Order, chaos, order. But it's partial order, chaos, reconstituted and revivified order. That's the thing, is that this order is better than that order. So there's progress. And that's partly why I think the idea of moral relativism is wrong. There's progress in moral order. And it was defined properly by Piaget. The new moral order does everything the old moral order did, and some additional things. That's what constitutes progress. Now, here's a strange idea. And we'll talk about this more as we progress through the class. What's the ultimate in order? Well, it's not this, obviously, because it can collapse. And it's not this, because it can collapse. And so then you think, well, there's no ultimate order, even though there's progression. But then you have to move it up one level of abstraction. What's the ultimate order? Doing this. Willingness to do that. That's the ultimate order. Right? It's order at a different level of analysis, and you can see that's what's represented in that idea. That's what that idea means. That's the phoenix, right? The phoenix is something that lives, ages, and then allows itself to be consumed by fire and then reemerges. And the old phoenix gets old and burns, and the new phoenix reemerges. And so the real phoenix is the thing that's constant across those transformations. That's the Jungian self. That's what he meant. The self is the element of the psyche that remains intact across transformations. Yeah. Yeah, it's a bloody amazing idea. That's for sure. And you could think about that. That's why Jung claimed, for example, in Ion, primarily, that Christ was a symbol of the self. That was his consequence of decades of meditation on the structure of Christianity. Because it's the dying and resurrecting part of the psyche that remains constant across the transformation. So the ultimate order isn't to identify with this. That's your current state of being. And it isn't to identify with that because, well, you can't by definition. And it isn't even to identify with that. It's to let these things go as they need to go. That's a sacrifice. And to allow this continual process of transformation to occur. And part of that is the admission that you're wrong. And so partly what you're doing is, at micro levels and at macro levels, where are you not what you could be? And when you realize that, it'll take you apart a little bit and burn you down to your core a little bit and then allow you to regenerate. And if you do that continually, then everything that you don't need burns away. Right? And that's what this means. You remember in Harry Potter, you may remember that Harry goes down, so in the second volume and in the second movie, Harry's at Hogwarts, so it's the school where you learn how to be magic, because that's what you really are. And there's something that threatens the school. Well, part of what threatens the school? Evil, right? Voldemort, that's one thing. But at the same time, it's also the snake that lurks underneath. It's the basilisk that threatens the school. And so the basilisk is the dragon, and when the basilisk looks at you, then you're paralyzed because you're a prey animal, and if a predator captures you in its gaze, you freeze. And the reason you freeze is because your body reacts to the predator as something that should turn you to stone. Sorry about that. So what do you do about the basilisk? Well, one thing you do is you run and hide. But the other thing you do is go confront it in its lair, and that's what Harry Potter does now. And what's interesting about him is he's also touched by evil, right? And that means that he's an embodiment of what Jung would regard as someone who's integrated the shadow. And without that capacity, he isn't able to communicate, say, with snakes. And that's not so good, because since there are snakes, it's not such a bad idea to know how to communicate with them. And he goes down into the underground, right, into the chaotic domain that's underneath the school in order to find the snake in its lair. Now, if I remember correctly, you tell me if I'm wrong. Doesn't he go down through a bathroom? Through a toilet? Right. Well, so that's an indication of the Jungian dictum that what you need most is to be found where you least want to look. I had a client once who actually had a dream like that. He dreamt that he had to go into the underground world through an outhouse. Right. It was very, very interesting. And it was an elaboration of precisely this theme. It's what you've thrown away as of little value to you, and maybe what you hate and hold in contempt and fear, is exactly what you have to face if you want to go down to the place where the transformations occur. So what happens in Harry Potter? Well, this basilisk is wandering around, paralyzing everyone who isn't able to communicate with snakes. And he doesn't fight the basilisk precisely. He goes down into its lairs, the underground world. And that, what down there is that snake has got Ginevra, right? His girlfriend, that's her name, right? It's a variant of Virginia. That's a variant of virgin. And the snake always has a virgin. That's one of its characteristics, right? Like gold. He goes down there to rescue her. What happens to him? He gets bit, and he's going to die. So what happens? The phoenix comes along and cries tears into his wounds and cures him. And that's... So the idea is that what saves you in the encounter with the snake is your capacity to let things go and die and come back to life. Right. It's so interesting, that story's told in that way in that series of volumes, because the plot structure is perfect in a mythological sense. It's exactly right. And the phoenix actually happens to be the pet of the main wizard, which is also perfect. It's exactly right. So, you know, what's his name? Dumbledore. Yeah, he's basically, for all intents and purposes, God the Father. And his pet, his close ally, is the thing that can die and that transforms. Well, you can see the echoes of Christian thought in that, but that isn't exactly right. It's that Christian thought and the mythological substructure upon which the Harry Potter volume is based are drawing from the same underlying pool of ideas and symbols. And they're universally accessible. And you can tell that because if they weren't, that book wouldn't have sold. How many million copies? How many million copies did it sell? And the movies. It's unbelievably, overwhelmingly powerful. She got kids to read 600-page books, like multiple volumes lining up for them. You got to ask yourself why. Silly stories about magical orphans. It's like, well, maybe not. Maybe people aren't so stupid. And certainly if they happen to be reading relatively complex books, attributing that to stupidity seems to be rather counterproductive. There's this thing that exists, this multi-headed snake, and it's got this infinity problem. It's everywhere. That's that little circle down there. And the problem is, well, what do you do with it? You cut off one head, 7 more grow. That's the eternal problem of life. And the problem is, there is the category of problems in life, and it ain't going anywhere. And so the question is, can you deal with the whole category at the same time? That's the thing. That's how to be in the world, is to deal with that category all at the same time. And so how did human beings, what did they come up with as a solution? And that's so cool too, because the solution they come up with not only was the heroism that allows you to approach what you're terrified by and what you find offensive and to learn from it, but also the idea of sacrifice. And that was played out by cultures everywhere, including human sacrifice. And you think, what the hell was up with those crazy bastards so long ago? They were sacrificing to gods all the time. What kind of clueless behavior was that? Burn something and please God. Burn something valuable and please God. It's like, what was with them? What were they thinking? Well, they weren't stupid, those people. If they were stupid, we wouldn't be here. They were not stupid. And believe me, they lived under a lot harsher conditions than we do. So those were some tough people, man. You know, back then you'd last about 15 minutes. And so you don't want to be thinking of your ancestors as stupid. Like, there's no real evidence that we're much different cognitively than we were 150,000 years ago. So anyways, sacrifice. What does that mean, sacrifice? Well, it's a discovery, man. It's the discovery of the future. It's like The future is actually the place where there is threat. And it's always going to be there. So what do? You make sacrifices in the present so that the future is better. Right. Everyone does that. That's what you're doing right now. That's what you're doing here. That's what your parents are doing when they pay money to send you to university. They think, you can bargain with reality. It's amazing. You can bargain with reality. You can forestall gratification now. And it'll pay off at a place and time that doesn't even exist yet. It's like, who would have believed that? It's like, that's a miracle that that occurs. And it's not like people just figured that out overnight. You know, we were chimps, for Christ's sake. Like, how are we going to come up with an idea like that? Well, it's like, well, we thought about it for 7 million years. And, you know, we got to the point where we could kind of act it out. But we didn't know what we were doing. But it emerged as like a dream. So the terror of the future is a dream. And the solution to the terror, the dream of the terror of the future, is another dream. And it comes out in mythology and in fantasy and in drama, where you act out the sacrifice. And then it's a step on the way to full understanding. So we can say sacrifice now instead of doing it, you know, although we still do it. It's just not concretized like it used to be. We do it abstractly. And we all have faith that it will work, you know, and we also set up our societies so that it'll work. And one thing about, you know, I'm not a fan of moral relativism for a variety of reasons. Partly because I think it's an extreme form of cowardice. But anyways, apart from that, no. There's minimal ways that you can set up a society that will work. And so one of them is that the society has to be set up so that your sacrifices will pay off, or you won't work, and then the society will die. And so it has to make promises. People have to make promises to one another. And that's what money is. Money is a promise that your sacrifice will pay off in the future. That's what money is. And so if the society is stable, you can store up your work right now, you can sacrifice your impulses, and you can work, and you can store up credit for the future, and then you can make the future a better place. But society has to be stable enough to allow for that. Hyperinflation will do you in. So the promise that's implicit in the currency is the promise that what you're doing now will pay off in the future. And if people don't have that promise, then, well, we know what they do. Because in gangs, for example, in, say, gangs in North America, the time horizon of the gang member shrinks rapidly because they don't really expect to be alive much past 21. And so they get really impulsive and violent. And like, why the hell not? That's what you do when the future doesn't matter, when it's not real. You default back to living in the moment, and you take what you can get right now. And no wonder, because you don't know if you're going to be around in a year. And you get whatever you can while you can bloody well get it. And that's like anarchy, that state. And so you don't want to live in, some people like to live in that state because they're really wired for that, you know. And so they're much more comfortable in those conditions. They're kind of like warrior types, I would say, in some sense. But, you know, for most people, that's just, well, that stress will just do you in, you know, the stress of a life like that. So